The Bible might be telling the same story over and over again, and most of us never notice. The same pattern seems to hide behind some of the most important stories and prophecies in the Old Testament. And the more it repeats, the more complete a story becomes. A story that seems to have been waiting for its ending since Genesis. What's strange is that it never comes back in quite the same way. Once it appears as a promise, later as a sacrifice, further on as a deliverance, a king, a temple, or a prophecy that seems to describe something that hasn't happened yet. On their own, they look like separate stories. But when you place them in the right order, something hard to ignore starts to happen. Each one seems to pick up right where the last one was left unfinished. And then you reach the last book of the Bible. There, some of the oldest images of all reappear. As if after thousands of years, the Bible were deliberately returning to the place where it all began. So maybe the real question isn't how many prophecies the Bible managed to fulfill. The question is much stranger than that. What story has it been telling from the very beginning? Before you settle in for tonight's story, if you're enjoying what we do here, a like or a subscription helps more than you'd think. But only if it feels genuine. And if you have a moment, tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight and what time it is there. That's always one of the best parts of reading the comments. Now dim the lights a little, get comfortable, and let's begin. Before there were prophets, before there were kings in Jerusalem, before Abraham ever knew the land that would one day be promised to his descendants, the Bible had already begun building its pattern. And to find it, you have to go back to a moment when nations, cities, and temples didn't exist yet. Just a garden, two human beings, and a relationship with God that had never known distance. Genesis describes that beginning with a simplicity that can make us move too quickly past its details. God forms the human being from the dust of the earth and breathes into him the breath of life. Then he plants a garden and places the man there. Everything seems to be in its place. There is life. There is food. There is purpose. And above all, there is something that will later become extraordinarily hard to recover: God and humanity living together. In the middle of the garden, two trees appear that we need to remember. One is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The other is the tree of life. The human being is free to eat from the trees of the garden, except for one. The prohibition is simple, but the warning that comes with it introduces, for the first time, a possibility that had never before been part of human experience. If you had been there, nothing around you would have made it possible to truly understand what that word meant. There were no graves. There were no memories of people who were gone. The pain of losing someone didn't exist yet. Death was only a warning about something that hadn't happened yet. And then the serpent appears. It doesn't come to destroy the garden. It doesn't knock down the trees or force anyone to disobey. Its first tool is much smaller. A question. The serpent takes what God had said and begins to twist it. It suggests that maybe the limit isn't there to protect the human being, but to deprive him of something. Maybe God is holding something back. Maybe taking what had been forbidden won't bring death, but a higher kind of knowledge. The temptation works because it turns a gift into a suspicion. The entire garden had been given to humanity, but suddenly all the attention gets caught on the one thing that couldn't be taken. Eve looks at the fruit. She finds it desirable, and she reaches out her hand. It's such a small gesture to carry such enormous consequences. No armies, no earthquakes, no cities falling. Just one person taking something from a tree. Then Adam eats too. And for the first time, something breaks. Their eyes are opened, but not in the way they expected. The first thing they discover isn't power. Shame. They cover themselves. Then they hear God approaching, and they do something that, until that moment, would have been unthinkable. They hide. Remember that image, because underneath many later stories, we'll find the same wound. The human being trying to pull away from the presence of the very one he was created to live with. God asks where they are. Not because the garden had become too big to find them, but because something in the relationship has changed. Adam blames Eve. Eve points to the serpent. The unity that existed just a few pages earlier begins to fall apart. Then the consequences arrive. Bang. conflict. A ground that will no longer give its fruit without a fight. And finally, the death that had once been only a warning enters the horizon of human life. But in the middle of those consequences, something unexpected appears. God speaks to the serpent about what will happen between it and the woman, between its offspring and the woman's offspring. And within those words, a strange image appears. The serpent will strike, but it will also be struck. A descendant, still unknown, will receive a blow and somehow will end up crushing the head of the very thing that started the break. The text doesn't give us a name. It doesn't tell us when it will happen. It doesn't even explain yet how we should understand that victory. And that's exactly what makes it so interesting. Because the first great promise after the fall isn't simply that things will get better. It introduces someone who doesn't exist yet within the story. Someone will have to come. But before we find out who, something else happens that will matter just as much to the pattern we're following. Adam and Eve are cast out of the garden. East of Eden, cherubim and a flaming sword remain, guarding the way to the tree of life. Humanity goes on living, but something has been left behind. The garden, the tree, and the presence of God. If you close the Bible at this point, it might seem like simply the sad ending of an ancient story about disobedience. But we know something its first characters couldn't have known yet. Those images aren't going to disappear. The tree will return. The presence of God will return. The serpent will return. Even the idea of a place where God dwells together with humanity will return, in forms that don't exist yet. But Genesis doesn't let us find that out just yet. First, it takes us outside the garden. You can picture Adam and Eve learning to live in a land different from the one they had known. Now the ground demands effort. Now there is weariness. Now they know shame and fear. And then something happens that might have felt at first like hope. A son is born. Eve names him Cain. Then Abel is born. For the first time, the mysterious promise about the woman's offspring might start to raise a question. If someone is one day meant to defeat what began with the serpent, could the answer be found among these sons? The Bible doesn't ask the question that way. It simply lets the story continue. Cain works the land. Abel tends flocks. In time, both bring an offering before God. Cain presents fruits of the earth, and Abel brings the firstborn of his flock. God looks favorably on Abel and his offering. Cain, on the other hand, becomes furious, and then he receives a warning that echoes unsettlingly what happened in the garden. Danger is near. Sin is described almost as something crouching at the door, wanting to control him. Once again, a human being stands before a choice. Once again, a warning comes before the line is crossed. And once again, the story takes the wrong path. Cain invites Abel out to the field. There, away from their parents, one brother rises up against the other and kills him. The first human death the Bible shows us doesn't come from illness or old age. It's a murder. Only one generation after Eden, the break has already gone from taking a forbidden fruit to spilling a brother's blood. Then God asks Cain where Abel is. The question inevitably echoes another question. Where are you? Now it becomes, where is your brother? And when Cain tries to escape his responsibility, God answers with one of the most unsettling images in the early chapters of Genesis. Abel's blood is crying out from the ground. For the first time, human blood has been spilled. For the first time, an innocent victim appears. And for the first time, the earth itself seems to become a witness to what happened. It's still too soon to explain why these images matter. But it's not too soon to remember them, because the pattern has only just begun. Abel's blood cries out from the ground, but no final answer arrives yet. Cain leaves. The generations continue. Sons are born, families rise, and names begin to spread across the pages of Genesis. Humanity learns to work with metal, to raise livestock, and to make music. At first glance, it might look like progress. But as human life grows more complex, so does violence. Not long after, Lamech appears, a man who boasts about killing someone for wounding him. What began with Cain trying to hide his brother's death has now become someone celebrating his own capacity for revenge. Violence no longer brings shame. It brings pride. And here you can see how the first story starts to repeat itself, but each time on a larger scale. In the garden, a couple crosses the line. Then one brother kills another. A few generations later, violence seems to have become part of human culture itself. The problem is growing. But that other line Genesis asked us to remember is still there too. Adam and Eve have another son, Seth. Eve speaks of him as someone given in place of Abel. And through his line, the story keeps moving forward, generation after generation, while a phrase begins to repeat with an almost uncomfortable regularity. He lived. He had children. And he died. Another lived, had children, and died. You can imagine what it must have felt like to hear those genealogies in a world where stories were passed down from generation to generation. The years could be many. The families could grow. The names could live on through the children. But the last word stayed the same. Died. The warning from the garden had become a reality no one could escape. Then an exception appears. In the middle of that long string of lives and deaths, Genesis mentions Enoch. He walks with God and suddenly the formula changes. We're not simply told that he died like the others. The text says he was no longer there because God took him. It's a small interruption. A tiny crack in a pattern that had seemed absolute. Death rules the genealogy, but for a moment, a man appears whose story doesn't end with the same words. Genesis doesn't explain much. And we don't need it to, not yet. Just watch how this story works. It sets a pattern. It repeats it until you recognize it. And then it introduces an exception that forces you to wonder whether what seemed inevitable really has to stay that way forever. The generations keep moving forward. Eventually we reach a world that feels very far removed from the garden where the story began. Genesis describes a humanity whose wickedness has multiplied across the earth. Violence no longer belongs only to a furious brother or a man proud of his revenge. Now it fills the world. What began with a serpent whispering a doubt has grown into a civilization unable to contain what it carries inside. And then Noah appears. His name arrives carrying a hope with it. When he's born, his father speaks of finding relief from the labor and pain caused by a ground that had been cursed. It's easy to skip past those words. But remember where our story began. The earth had fallen under a curse after the fall. Now a child is born, and his own family wonders whether he might bring rest from that curse. For a moment, Noah looks exactly like the kind of figure we've been waiting for. A righteous man in the middle of a corrupt generation. Someone who walks with God. Someone whose family will be preserved while the world around him faces judgment. Then God tells him to build an ark. You can picture the years of work. The wood cut and prepared. The structure slowly taking shape. The steady sound of tools while, all around, life goes on as if it had no reason to stop. Then the animals arrive. The family goes in. The door closes. And the rain begins. The waters rise until the roads disappear, then the fields, and finally the high ground that had once defined that world. For a time, everything humanity had built lies beneath the water. If you listen closely to the language of Genesis, there's something familiar about this scene. At the very beginning of the Bible, the waters covered the earth before God brought forth creation. Now the waters cover it again. It's as if the world were being pulled backward. As if creation were starting over. After many days, the waters begin to go down. The ark finally comes to rest. Noah waits. He sends out birds to find out whether land has reappeared. Finally, a dove returns carrying an olive leaf. There is dry ground again. The animals come out. A family sets foot once more on land that feels new. And God tells them to multiply. The similarities to the beginning are hard to ignore. Land rising up out of the waters. Animals spreading across it. Human beings once again given responsibility over the world. If any story seemed capable of breaking the pattern, it was this one. The old humanity has been left behind. Noah can start again. And this might be the point where you'd expect Genesis to finally show us a restored humanity. But something deeply telling happens instead. Noah plants a vineyard. He drinks its wine. And he becomes drunk. Abram lives in a world still carrying the consequences of Babel. Families have scattered, languages have divided, and nations are beginning to settle into different territories. Then God asks something extraordinarily simple and difficult at the same time. To leave. To leave his land, his relatives, and his father's house, and walk toward a place he doesn't know yet. He isn't given a map. He isn't given a city already built or a kingdom ready to receive him. He's given a promise. God will make him into a great nation. He will make his name great. He will bless him. And then a phrase appears that quietly changes the scale of the entire story. Through Abram, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Think about how strange that is after Babel. There, humanity had tried to make a name for itself and ended up scattered. Now God takes a single man, promises to make his name great, and declares that somehow the blessing will reach the very families we just watched come apart. The direction has reversed. At Babel, human beings were trying to rise up. With Abram, God calls him. At Babel, they wanted to build their own greatness. Abram receives a promise he can't build for himself. And here begins a tension that will stay with us for a long time, because almost everything God promises Abram seems impossible when you look at the man who just received it. He's supposed to become a great nation, but he has no children. His descendants are supposed to possess a land. But Abram is a foreigner who just left his own. And through him, blessing is supposed to reach other families. But Abram still doesn't understand how something like that could ever happen. So he sets out. If you had traveled with him, you would have seen a world of unmarked roads, nights spent under tents, and territories where Abram owns almost nothing. The promise is enormous, but his everyday life still looks small. Years pass, and the promised son doesn't come. This waiting matters because the Bible could have had the child born right away. Instead, it lets Abram grow old. Sarai grows old too. The human possibility keeps shrinking while the promise stays exactly the same. Abram begins to wonder how it could ever be fulfilled. At one point, God takes him outside at night. Look up at the sky. Try to count the stars. So shall your descendants be. The image is beautiful, but it also holds an almost painful contradiction. Above Abram there are more lights than he can count. Inside his tent, there isn't even one son he can call his own. And maybe this is where another feature of the pattern starts to appear. The promise comes first. Then comes a stretch of time where it seems impossible. And only then does something arrive to keep it alive. But Abram and Sarai don't always wait. They try to find a solution of their own. Through Hagar, Ishmael is born. It's a deeply human decision. If the promise is taking too long, maybe they can help fulfill it themselves. And yet the story keeps insisting that the son around whom the covenant will continue still hasn't been born. Finally, when Abram is 99 years old, his name changes. Abram becomes Abraham. Sarai becomes Sarah. And God speaks again of a son. Sarah laughs. Not because the promise is small, but because it seems far too big for the aging body of a woman who has waited so many years. But the child is born. They name him Isaac. His name carries the memory of that laughter. And for a moment, it seems like one of the great tensions of the story has finally been resolved. Abraham has the son. The promise has an heir. The line can continue. Then comes one of the most unsettling scenes in all of Genesis. God calls out to Abraham again. And this time he isn't asked to leave a land. He's asked for Isaac, the son who took decades to arrive. The son the entire future of the promise seemed to rest on. Abraham is told to take him to a mountainous region and offer him there. The story grows strangely quiet. Abraham gets up early. He saddles his donkey. He takes 2 servants and Isaac. He cuts the wood needed and sets out on the journey. For 3 days they travel toward the place he was told about. 3 days in which Abraham has to walk knowing what waits for him at the end of the road. When he finally sees the place in the distance, he leaves the servants behind. Isaac carries the wood. Abraham carries the fire and the knife. Father and son continue on together. Then Isaac notices what's missing. They have fire. They have wood. But there's no animal for the sacrifice. Abraham answers that God will provide. And they keep climbing. There's no need to rush through this scene, because here an image appears that the Bible will hold on to for centuries. A father. A beloved son. A mountain. What? And a question about where the sacrifice will come from. Abraham builds the altar. He lays out the wood. He binds Isaac. And as he raises the knife, the story reaches the very edge of what had seemed impossible. Then a voice stops him. Abraham looks around. A ram has been caught by its horns in a thicket. Isaac comes down from the altar. The ram takes his place. And for the first time, an idea that will later become immensely important appears before us in a way that's impossible to forget. One was going to die, but another dies in his place. Abraham names that place after God's provision. The promise continues. Isaac lives. And we could easily move on, thinking we've simply witnessed an extraordinary test of Abraham's faith. But remember what we're looking for. Stories that seem to end and then come back in another form. Images that appear once, disappear for generations, and return when the story needs to add a new piece. Abraham's mountain hasn't told us everything yet. Neither has the sacrifice. Neither has the son. Isaac grows up, starts a family, and has 2 sons, Esau and Jacob. And once again, the family carrying the promise is far from perfect. There's rivalry. There's favoritism. There's deception. Jacob takes the blessing meant for his brother and ends up fleeing his home. Years later he returns, and along the way he receives a new name, Israel. That name will end up belonging not just to one man but to an entire people. Jacob has 12 sons. And among them is one who holds a special place in his father's heart, Joseph. His father loves him openly and his brothers know it. When Joseph starts telling them about dreams in which his family bows down to him, their resentment slowly turns into hatred, until one day his brothers find him far from home. For a moment they consider killing him. In the end they choose something else. They sell him. Joseph disappears into Egypt as a slave, while his brothers take his robe, stain it with blood, and let Jacob believe his son is dead. Pause for a moment, because something ancient has just returned. Brothers at war with each other. What? A lost son. The story of Cain and Abel seems to echo again, but this time there's a difference. Joseph isn't dead. He goes down into Egypt and loses almost everything that had defined his life. He no longer has his father's protection. He no longer has freedom. He doesn't even have control over his own future. And then he falls even further. A false accusation lands him in prison. The beloved son becomes a slave. The slave becomes a prisoner. If his story ended there, it would just be another story of injustice. But it doesn't end there. Joseph has a particular gift for interpreting dreams, and that gift eventually brings him before Pharaoh. Egypt is about to face 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine. Joseph proposes storing food while there's still time. And in a way that's almost impossible to have predicted, the prisoner is raised up to become one of the most powerful men in Egypt. The rejected one now holds authority. The man who had sunk to the bottom begins to rise. Then the famine comes, not only to Egypt, but also to the land where Joseph's family lives. His brothers travel in search of food and end up bowing before an Egyptian ruler they don't recognize. Joseph recognizes them. The men who sold him are now standing before him. They need the very thing only he can give them. Joseph could take revenge. He could let them die. But after a series of tests, he finally reveals who he is. You can imagine the silence. The brother they had handed over. The son they believed was lost. The man whose life they had tried to destroy is alive. And now he's the very one who can save them. Joseph ends up interpreting his own suffering in an extraordinary way. They had meant to harm him. But that same path ended up placing Joseph exactly where he could preserve many lives. Once again, the pattern has taken a new shape. Someone is rejected. He goes down. He suffers unjustly. Then he's raised up. And from that new position he brings life to the very people who rejected him. We don't need to say yet where this is pointing. We just need to notice that the Bible has just added another piece. Jacob's family then moves to Egypt. There they find refuge. There's food. There's safety. And the descendants of Israel begin to multiply. But before he dies, Joseph leaves one last instruction. Someday, he says, God will visit his people and lead them out of Egypt, toward the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. When that day comes, they must carry his bones with them. Joseph dies. He's placed in a coffin in Egypt. And that's how Genesis ends. Not in the garden. Not in the promised land. Not with the serpent defeated. It ends with a coffin. Death is still present. The promise is still incomplete. And the family chosen to bring blessing to the nations is living outside the land they were meant to receive. Generations pass. Joseph becomes a distant memory. The descendants of Israel multiply into a great people, and a new Pharaoh rises to power. This Pharaoh doesn't remember what Joseph did for Egypt. He looks at the Israelites and doesn't see a family that once saved the country from famine. He sees a threat. So the slavery begins. The Israelites are forced into labor. Their lives are filled with burdens, orders, and exhausting days. But the more they're oppressed, the more they multiply. Pharaoh then decides to strike at the very thing that keeps any nation alive. Its children. He orders that every Hebrew baby boy be thrown into the Nile. And in the middle of that decree, a boy is born. His mother manages to hide him for 3 months. After that, she can't anymore. She prepares a small basket, seals it so the water can't get in, and places her son inside. Then she leaves him among the reeds of the river. A child condemned to die. Water. A small vessel. And a family waiting, not knowing what will happen. Even here, something feels familiar. But this time the child survives. Pharaoh's own daughter finds him. She names him Moses. And without knowing it, the house of the man trying to destroy the sons of Israel has just taken in the boy who will one day return to face him. Moses grows up between two worlds. By birth, he belongs to the enslaved people. By upbringing, he lives inside the house that rules over them. And one day, that contradiction becomes something he can no longer ignore. He sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. Moses steps in and kills the Egyptian. But his attempt to defend one of his own doesn't bring freedom. It brings fear. When he finds out that what happened is known, he flees. The man who once seemed destined to confront Egypt disappears into the desert. Years pass. Moses starts a family and becomes a shepherd. The palace is behind him now. So are the Israelites in their forced labor. Until one day he sees fire. A bush burns without being consumed. Moses comes closer and hears his name. God tells him he has seen Israel's suffering. He has heard their cry. He knows their pain. And now he will send Moses back. The fugitive must stand before Pharaoh and demand the freedom of an entire people. Moses hesitates. He asks who he is to do something like that. But maybe that's exactly the difference. Babel had been built by people convinced of their own ability. Moses begins his mission wondering whether he's capable of it at all. He returns to Egypt. And the confrontation begins. Pharaoh refuses to let Israel go. Then the plagues come. The Nile turns to blood. Frogs cover the land. Insects, disease, and darkness follow. One after another, Egypt's certainties start to crack. But Pharaoh keeps resisting, until word comes of one last night. And before it happens, God gives Israel a very specific instruction. Each family is to take a lamb. They are to sacrifice it. Then they are to put its blood on the doorposts and above the door. Inside the house they will eat, ready to leave. Outside death will come. And wherever the blood is, judgment will pass over. Now remember Abraham's mountain. There was a son there. There was death. And at the last moment, an animal appeared and died while the son walked away alive. That was one familiar scene. This time it happens in thousands of homes. In every Israelite house, there's a firstborn son whose life is on the line. And between that son and death, a sacrifice appears once again. A lamb dies. The son lives. The image has come back. But it's grown bigger now. It's no longer just about Isaac. Now an entire people will have to remember that night, generation after generation. Passover becomes a memory. Every year, Israel will have to retell how they left Egypt. how the blood was on the doors, how death passed over, how the slaves were set free. Because when morning comes, Pharaoh finally gives in. Israel leaves. After generations of slavery, the people begin walking toward freedom. But Pharaoh changes his mind again. He sends his chariots after them, and the Israelites find themselves trapped. Ahead lies the sea. Behind them the army closes in. There's no visible way out. Then the waters part. Israel crosses on dry ground. The Egyptians try to follow, but the waters rush back. And the army that represented the power of their slavery disappears behind them. Once again, familiar images return. Water. Judgment. People preserved. A new beginning. The flood had carried Noah through the waters into a renewed earth. Now Israel crosses the waters and leaves slavery behind. But we also know something the earlier great beginnings already taught us. Surviving the water doesn't automatically transform the human heart. It didn't happen with Noah. It won't happen with Israel either. On the other side of the sea, the desert begins. And there, freedom quickly runs into hunger and thirst. The people grumble. They remember Egypt. Strangely enough, slavery starts to look safe compared to a future they still can't see. God gives them manna. He provides water. And finally he leads them to Mount Sinai. There, something essential to our pattern takes place. God hasn't just brought Israel out of Egypt. He wants to dwell in the middle of them. Since the beginning of Genesis, that idea should catch our attention. In the garden, God and humanity shared a single place. After the fall, the human being was cast out. Now, in the middle of the desert, God commands a sanctuary to be built so he can dwell among his people. The tabernacle. If you had walked into its courtyard, you would have found a space organized around boundaries that grow more and more defined. An altar, priests, sacrifices, then a tent, inside a holy place, and behind a curtain the most restricted space of all, the most holy place. There the Ark of the Covenant would rest. There the sign of God's presence would gather in a special way. Humanity has God dwelling near it once again. But there's still a curtain. There are still boundaries. Blood is still needed to draw near. It's a restoration, but an incomplete one. As if the Bible had slowly begun the road back to Eden, but the door still couldn't open all the way. And around that door a new figure appears. The priest. Someone who can draw near on behalf of others. Someone who enters where no one else can. Someone who carries blood with him. The pattern has just added another piece. We already have a promise. A son. A sacrifice. A lamb. A deliverance. And now, a mediator who can approach the presence of God on the people's behalf. But even he will find a door he can't leave open forever. Once a year, that limitation becomes especially visible. On the Day of Atonement, the high priest passes through the curtain and enters the most holy place. He doesn't enter freely. He doesn't enter whenever he wants. And he doesn't enter without blood. For a few hours, one man represents the entire nation before God. Sacrifices are offered for sin, and the people are given a picture of purification and forgiveness. But when the day ends, the curtain is still there. The following year, the ritual will have to be repeated. And then again. And again. The repetition reveals something important. If the sacrifice had settled the problem once and for all, there would be no need to come back every year. Israel can draw near. But it still can't stay. God's presence is in the middle of the people, and yet the way to it is still guarded. It's hard not to think of Eden. There too was a lost presence. There too was a path humanity could no longer freely walk. And there too, cherubim stood guarding what had been left behind. Now images of cherubim appear once again around the most sacred space of the tabernacle. The story seems to be circling back toward the garden. But a barrier still stands. Then, as Israel crosses the desert, something even stranger happens. The people rebel again. They complain against God and against Moses, and venomous snakes appear in the camp. The bites start to spread. People die. After everything we've seen since Genesis, snakes showing up here can hardly feel like a neutral image. The Bible's first great break began with a serpent. Now Israel finds itself facing serpents and death once again. The people admit their sin and ask for help. Then God gives Moses an unexpected instruction. He is to make a bronze serpent. He is to raise it up on a pole. And anyone who has been bitten will be able to look at it and live. Take a moment to notice how strange that scene is. The image of the very thing associated with death is lifted up in front of the people who are dying. And looking toward it brings life. You don't need to work out what it means yet. The Bible itself will leave that image waiting for a long time. For now, it's enough to hold on to it. A serpent, lifted up. People who were doomed to die. And life received by looking toward it. The journey continues. But the generation that left Egypt won't be the one that finally enters the promised land. The years pass. Moses grows old. And after leading the people for decades, he comes to a mountain from which he can look out over the land promised to Abraham. He can see it, but he won't enter it. There's something deeply unfinished about that ending. Moses stood up to Pharaoh. He led Israel through the sea. He climbed Sinai. He interceded for the people. And even so, he can't bring them all the way in. Before he dies, he leaves a promise. Someday God will raise up among Israel a prophet like him. Another expectation is left open. Another figure still to come, one we don't know yet. After Moses dies, Joshua takes his place. Israel reaches the Jordan River. And once again there's water between the people and what has been promised to them. The waters stop. The people cross. After generations of waiting, Abraham's descendants finally enter the land. We might think the story has reached its destination. They have a land. They're a nation. They have the law. They have priests. God dwells in their midst. But remember the question we've carried since the beginning. Has the thing that drove humanity out of the garden disappeared? No. Israel enters the land and soon another cycle begins. The people drift away from God. Enemies come. Israel suffers. Then they cry out for help. God raises up a deliverer. The enemy is defeated. There's rest. And after some time, it all starts over again. Drifting away. Oppression. Crying out. Deliverance. Rest. And drifting away again. The book of Judges turns that movement into a kind of rhythm. Each deliverer looks for a moment, like the person Israel needs. But none of them manages to break the cycle. They can defeat an army. They can't stop the next generation from falling again. They can free the people from an outside enemy. They can't free them from what keeps growing on the inside. And that difference matters. The problem can no longer be explained away by Egypt. Pharaoh is long gone. It can't be explained by the lack of a land either. Israel already has one. David enters the story as a shepherd, but he soon finds himself facing an enemy who has paralyzed all of Israel. Goliath. 4 days, the Philistine warrior challenges Israel's army. The soldiers hear his words and back away. David doesn't look ready to face him. He doesn't wear the armor of a great warrior. He has no comparable experience. Standing in front of Goliath, he looks like exactly the opposite of what Israel would have chosen as its champion. And yet he wins. The young shepherd defeats the enemy the entire army was too afraid to face. The image is simple but powerful. Once again, deliverance comes through someone who seemed far too small to carry it. In time, David becomes king. Jerusalem becomes central to his kingdom, and the Ark of the Covenant is brought there. Then David looks at his own house and thinks about the presence of God. He lives in a palace. The Ark sits in a tent. David wants to build a temple. But the answer he gets turns the story around once again. David wants to build a house for God. God promises to build a house for David. He doesn't speak first about stone or wood. He speaks about descendants. After David will come a son. His line will continue. And within that promise appears a phrase that changes everything we expected from the monarchy. His throne will be established forever. Forever. A king can rule for decades. A family can hold onto a crown for generations. But an eternal throne calls for something different. And here, several old promises start moving closer together. In Genesis, we were waiting for a descendant. With Abraham, the promise continued through offspring that would bring blessing to the nations. Now that hope runs through the house of David, the future starts to take the shape of a king. David dies. Solomon, his son, takes the throne. And for a while, everything seems to move toward fulfillment. The kingdom prospers. Jerusalem grows. And Solomon builds what David had wanted to build. The temple. If you had walked inside, some of its details would have stirred very old memories. Gold. cherubim, palm trees, flowers, images of life surrounding a place tied to the presence of God. After so many pages, something like the memory of the garden seems to appear within Israel's own architecture. At the center is the most holy place. The presence of God is once again in the middle of his people. A son of David sits on the throne. The promised land belongs to Israel. The temple stands in Jerusalem. For a moment, it feels like the pieces are finally falling into place. But the Bible has already taught us not to trust endings that come too soon. Solomon grows old, and his heart turns away. The king known for his wisdom ends up doing exactly what he should have avoided. After his death, the kingdom splits, north and south, Israel and Judah. The unity breaks apart. Kings come and go, and some try to set things right, but many lead the people even further astray. Then the prophets begin to rise, and with them the pattern gains a new voice. Up to this point, many of the connections we've been following were hidden inside stories. Now they start turning into words about the future as well. The prophets look at a divided kingdom, an unfaithful nation, and a monarchy that seems unable to fulfill the promise made to David. But instead of giving up on that promise, they begin describing a king who hasn't come yet. Isaiah speaks of a child, a son, someone on whose shoulders the government will rest. And the language used to describe his reign goes far beyond what we'd expect from an ordinary monarch. His rule will bring a peace that seems to reach beyond any military victory. Isaiah later returns to David's family with another image. A tree cut down. Only a stump remains. It looks dead, but out of that stump comes a shoot. From the roots of Jesse, David's father, someone new will appear. The dynasty might look destroyed. The promise doesn't. And around that future ruler, Isaiah describes something that recalls a world we've already lost. The wolf lives with the lamb. Danger no longer rules. Creation itself seems to enter into a kind of peace. The hope is no longer just about getting a good king. It starts to look like a restoration. But while the prophets speak of that future, the present keeps falling apart. The northern kingdom falls to Assyria. Later, Judah moves toward disaster too. Jerusalem, the city of David, is finally besieged by Babylon. The temple is destroyed. The king is defeated. And many of the people are carried off into exile. Think about what this means for every promise we've been following. The land is lost. The temple is gone. David's throne looks empty. The people are living far from home once again. It's hard not to feel that the story has circled back to an old wound. Expulsion, loss, exile. Humanity left Eden. Now Israel leaves the promised land. But right when everything seems to be falling apart, the prophets begin speaking with an even bolder hope. Jeremiah announces that a day will come when God will make a new covenant. And this time something is different. The law won't just be written outside the human being. It will be written within. Ezekiel takes the image even further. He speaks of a new heart, of a new spirit, of a heart of stone replaced by a heart able to respond. Suddenly, the problem we watched repeat from Noah all the way to the Judges gets a direct answer. Maybe humanity doesn't just need another fresh start. Maybe it needs to become, in some way, something new. And while Israel lives far from Jerusalem, another vision appears. A vision of dry bones. A valley full of death. And before the prophet's eyes, what seemed completely lost begins to receive life again. The exile starts to look less like the end of Israel and more like another one of those scenes we already know. Descent, loss, death. And then, against all expectation, the possibility of return. But the return from exile won't settle everything either. Decades later, some Israelites return to Jerusalem. The temple is rebuilt. The sacrifices resume. The walls go up again. From a distance, it might look like the story is simply going back to normal. But something is missing. David's glorious kingdom hasn't returned. Israel is still living under the power of foreign empires. And those great promises from the prophets seem far too large for what now exists in Jerusalem. The people are back in the land. But they're still waiting. And this is exactly where we need to look back. Because for hundreds of years, the Bible has been gathering images that still haven't found a full resolution. A serpent has to be defeated. Abraham's blessing has to reach the nations. A prophet like Moses has to appear. A descendant of David has to sit on an eternal throne. A new covenant has to come. The human heart has to change. And somehow, the separation between God and humanity has to end. They look like separate promises. At least that's how they seem. But then Isaiah introduces a figure who makes the pattern even stranger. He doesn't appear first as a conqueror. He appears as a servant. And this servant suffers. He's rejected, despised, wounded. The description is unsettling because this figure seems to be doing something for others precisely through his suffering. He carries pain that doesn't seem to belong to him. He's wounded for wrongs that aren't his own. And once again, an image appears that we've known for a long time. One suffers. Others receive the benefit. It brings to mind Isaac coming down alive from the altar while another sacrifice takes his place. It brings to mind the houses in Egypt, where a lamb dies and the firstborn lives. It brings to mind the sacrifices of the tabernacle. But now the image no longer centers on an animal. It centers on a person. That changes something. For generations, Israel has watched animals brought to the altar, has seen blood, has celebrated Passover, has watched the high priest enter the most holy place with sacrifices. But Isaiah describes a human being whose suffering seems to serve a purpose that echoes, unsettlingly, all of those earlier images. And there's still more. After describing his suffering and his death, the text keeps speaking of him as if death couldn't be the final word. The story seems to pass through death and continue on the other side. Once again, descent, suffering, and then something unexpected. By now, you can probably feel why this pattern is so hard to reduce to a single prophecy. We're not just following isolated predictions. We're following a story that seems to be learning how to talk about itself. First it uses events, then symbols, then rituals, then kings, then prophets, and each one adds a piece the others had left unfinished. But a contradiction remains. The prophets seem to be waiting for a victorious king. They also describe a servant who suffers. They expect restoration, but they speak of someone rejected. They promise a kingdom, but they also speak of wounds. How can those images belong to the same story? The Bible doesn't rush to answer. And while that question stays open, another prophet receives a very different vision. Daniel lives under the power of foreign empires. In his visions, kingdoms rise and vanish, pictured as beasts. One replaces another. Power changes hands. But none of them last. Then Daniel sees a different scene. He sees someone like a son of man approaching the Ancient of Days. This figure is given dominion, glory, a kingdom. And once again that word appears, the one that seemed impossible when it was first spoken over the house of David. His dominion will not pass away. His kingdom will not be destroyed. The old hope of an eternal king is still alive. But now it looks far bigger than the throne of one small nation. Peoples, nations, languages. The vision expands. The blessing promised to Abraham was meant to reach the families of the earth. The king promised to David was meant to hold a permanent throne. Now Daniel sees a kingdom that brings both of those ideas together. One ruler. And the nations. The pieces are drawing closer. But they still don't fully fit together. Because we still have Isaiah's suffering servant. We still have the eternal king. We still have the prophet like Moses. We still have the sacrifices. We still have the problem of the heart. And we still have that serpent from the very first pages. It's like watching different roads converge toward a point still hidden beyond the horizon. Then the pages of the Old Testament begin drawing to a close. Israel waits. The empires go on. Generations are born and die. The sacrifices keep being offered. The promise made to David still hasn't produced the king who will reign forever. And the way to God's presence still isn't fully open. We might think that after so many centuries the pattern has failed. But maybe the exact opposite is true. Maybe it's been gathering enough pieces so that when what they were all pointing to finally appears, we'll be able to recognize it. A descendant, a son, a lamb, a deliverer, a prophet, a priest, a king, a wounded servant. No earlier figure managed to be all of those things at once. And that might be the most important detail so far. Because maybe the Bible hasn't been waiting on many different answers. Maybe it's been slowly describing from different angles, a single answer that still hasn't stepped onto the stage. And when that answer finally enters the story, the Bible doesn't introduce it with an army, a crown, or a throne. It begins with a birth. That feels strange after everything we've gathered so far. We were expecting a descendant able to defeat the serpent, an heir of Abraham tied to the blessing of the nations, a king from the house of David, a prophet like Moses, a figure whose kingdom would never end. And yet the New Testament opens its story by tracing a genealogy, name after name, generation after generation. It might seem like an unexciting way to start, until you remember that we've been following a single line of descent through the whole Bible. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, David. The genealogy is already doing something before Jesus speaks a single word. It's placing him inside the story we already know. He doesn't show up disconnected from the Old Testament. He shows up exactly within the lines of promise that had been open for centuries. And then his birth adds another connection. Jesus is born in Bethlehem, the small town tied to David. He isn't born at the political center of the Roman Empire, or inside a royal palace. He's born in the place of the old shepherd who became king. But almost immediately a threat appears. Herod hears about the birth of someone associated with royalty, and he's afraid. He orders the children of Bethlehem killed. Once again, a ruler fears that among the sons of Israel, someone capable of threatening his power might be growing up. The image echoes Egypt. Pharaoh had ordered the death of Hebrew children. Now another king does something similar. And just as with Moses, the child survives. But the connection goes even further. Jesus' family flees to Egypt, then returns. Israel's story had been one of going down into Egypt and later coming out. Now the life of a single person seems to begin walking a similar road. It won't be the last time. When Jesus grows up and begins his public life, he goes to the Jordan River. He goes into the water, then comes out. And from there he heads into the desert. Water, then desert. If you followed Israel from the sea to Sinai, this sequence should feel familiar. Israel passed through the waters and was then tested in the desert. Jesus passes through the waters and then enters the desert to be tested. But here something is different. Israel had failed again and again during its time in the desert. It had doubted. It had complained. It had wanted to go back. Jesus faces temptation and responds differently. Even the words he uses come from the very texts tied to Israel's experience in the desert. It's as if a story that once belonged to an entire nation is being walked through again by a single person. But this time without repeating the same failure. And that forces us to look at the pattern from another angle. Maybe we're not just watching predictions being fulfilled. Maybe we're watching old stories return, concentrated into one life. Then Jesus begins calling disciples. He teaches. He heals the sick. He draws near to people considered unclean. And he announces the arrival of the kingdom of God. The kingdom. Another word we've been waiting for. For centuries, the promise made to David had left open the hope of a ruler whose throne would last. The prophets had spoken of that future. Daniel had seen a kingdom that would never be destroyed. Now Jesus talks constantly about a kingdom. But he doesn't start by raising an army. He doesn't try to immediately drive out Rome. He doesn't take a palace. That unsettles even the people following him. Because if he's connected to the expected king, the way he acts doesn't look anything like the kings they know. And then other images start to appear. Jesus feeds crowds in remote places. The people receive food where there didn't seem to be enough. It's hard not to think of the manna. He speaks of himself using images T. As Jesus keeps teaching, that possibility stops being a distant suspicion. He starts speaking about his own death. His disciples don't want to hear it. To them, the idea seems contradictory. If Jesus really is the awaited king, if the kingdom is coming with him, how can it end with him rejected and dead? Peter even tries to talk him out of that path. But Jesus insists, the story has to pass through suffering. And so his journey to Jerusalem begins. The city of David, the city of the temple, the place where sacrifices have been offered for generations. When Jesus enters, the crowd welcomes him like a king. There are branches. There are voices celebrating. There's an expectation that seems to have waited centuries to reach this moment. But Jesus doesn't head to a palace to take a throne. He heads to the temple. And there, the old conflict resurfaces. between the presence of God and what human beings have turned the place meant to hold it into. The following days move toward Passover. That matters, because Jesus' death won't happen at just any point on Israel's calendar. It will happen while the people are remembering another death, another night, another deliverance. At every Passover celebration, families remember Egypt. They remember slavery. They remember the lamb. They remember the blood. They remember that death passed over and that after that night, the road to freedom began. Now Jesus sits down to eat with his disciples in that same setting. And during the meal, he takes the bread. Then he takes the cup. But he speaks of them in a new way. He connects them to himself. The old celebration of a deliverance starts pointing toward another one. And the image of the new covenant, announced long before by Jeremiah, appears in this very last meal. Remember what the prophet had promised. A day would come when God would establish a new covenant. Now, in Jerusalem, as Passover is about to begin, Jesus uses that very language. The pieces keep drawing closer. Then night falls. Jesus is arrested. His disciples scatter. The man they had followed as king is brought before religious and political authorities. He's accused, beaten, humiliated. And then something happens loaded with an irony hard to miss. The soldiers place a crown on him, but it's made of thorns. They dress him up like a king to mock him. Without meaning to, the scene brings together two images we've been following from very different places. A king, and a curse. Because thorns belong to our story too. After the fall, the ground would produce thorns and thistles. Now the man presented as king wears on his head a crown made from the very thing that once recalled the curse. Then they take him to be crucified, and Jesus carries the wood. It's impossible to reach this scene after walking with Isaac up the mountain without feeling an echo. A son. What? A father. A sacrifice. But this time, no ram is caught in the bushes to take the son's place. This time the story keeps going. Jesus is lifted up, and that other image returns. The bronze serpent had been lifted up in the desert while those doomed to die looked toward it and received life. Jesus had said that he too would be lifted up. Now he is. But there's still another connection. Passover. While Israel remembers the lambs whose blood was on the doors in Egypt, Jesus dies in Jerusalem. The awaited king is dying like a sacrifice. The promised son is being wounded. The servant described by Isaiah is being rejected. Images that for centuries seemed to belong to separate stories start converging on the same moment. And then something happens inside the temple. The curtain tears. The barrier that had separated the most holy place from the rest of the sanctuary for generations is thrown open. Remember how long we've been watching that separation. Eden ended with a closed path. The tabernacle let God dwell in the middle of Israel, but behind a curtain. The temple kept that same separation. The high priest could only cross it under very specific conditions. Now as Jesus dies, the curtain opens. The pattern has just touched one of its oldest wounds. But the bigger problem still remains. Death. Ever since the genealogies of Genesis, that word had followed generation after generation. Abraham died. Isaac died. Jacob died. Joseph died. Moses died. David died. Even the great deliverers and kings ended up entering that same silence. And now Jesus dies too. His body is placed in a tomb. A stone seals the entrance. For a moment, it seems like every connection we've just found has led to exactly the same ending as all the others. The promised descendant is dead. The king is dead. The man who spoke of a kingdom is inside a tomb. If the story ended there, the pattern would have reached its darkest point. But the Bible has spent too long teaching us something. Every time it seems like the promise has gone down to a place it can't return from, something unexpected happens. Joseph got out of prison. Israel got out of Egypt. The exiles came home. The dry bones received life in Ezekiel's vision. And now, on the third day, some women arrive at the tomb. The stone has been rolled away. The place where the body should be is empty. Death, for the first time, fails to hold on to what it had received. And if that's true, then the pattern wasn't simply leading toward a sacrifice. It was leading toward something far greater. A death that could somehow become the beginning of a new creation. The resurrection changes how we look at everything that came before. Up to that point, many of the stories we followed could look like simple rescue stories. Isaac is spared from the altar. Joseph gets out of prison. Israel escapes Egypt. The exiles return to Jerusalem. But none of those rescues manages to defeat death once and for all. Isaac lives, but someday he dies. Joseph is raised up, but Genesis ends with his body inside a coffin. Israel leaves Egypt, but the desert generation fades away over the years. David receives an extraordinary promise, but he too ends up in a tomb. With Jesus, something different happens. He isn't rescued before dying. He passes through death and comes back. That means the old sequence has changed. The promise is no longer just about escaping danger. Now there's the possibility of passing through the very thing that, since Genesis, had seemed irreversible and coming out on the other side. But the story isn't over yet. Jesus meets with his disciples again. The same men who had fled during his arrest now have to understand what just happened. And before leaving them, he gives them a mission that takes us back to Abraham. Remember that promise. Through Abraham, the families of the earth would be blessed. For centuries, that phrase stayed open. The story narrowed down to one family, then to one nation, then to one king. But the promise had always been looking further out, toward the nations. Now Jesus sends his followers straight toward them. The story that had seemed to narrow for generations starts expanding again. From one, to a family. From a family, to Israel. From Israel, to a king. And now, from that king back out toward the world. But the disciples still need something. The prophets had spoken of an inner change. Jeremiah had announced a law written on the heart. Ezekiel had spoken of a new spirit. The solution couldn't just be handing over another list of instructions. Israel had already shown that knowing the way didn't necessarily mean being able to walk it. Then Pentecost comes. The disciples are gathered together when the Spirit of God comes upon them. And something unusual happens. They start speaking in other languages. People from different places can hear the message in their own tongues. After everything we've seen, it's hard to reach this scene without thinking of Babel. Their languages had been confused. Humanity had ended up scattered. Now the differences between languages don't disappear, but they stop being a barrier to hearing the same message. Babel had shown humanity trying to build its own way up to heaven. Pentecost shows something coming down to humanity instead. Another reversal. Another echo. Another old story that seems to return, transformed. And the movement keeps going. The message leaves Jerusalem, crosses borders, reaches people who don't belong to Israel. The blessing promised to Abraham begins spreading among the nations. But here an important question comes up. If Jesus has risen, if the sacrifice has happened, and if the promise is starting to reach the world, why doesn't the story of the Bible end here? Why does suffering still exist? Why does death continue? Why does the world still look so much like the world we already knew? That question leads us into the last major part of the pattern. Because the Bible starts drawing a line between something that has already begun and something that's still waiting for its full completion. The King has come. But the kingdom hasn't yet shown its full fullness. Death has been defeated in Jesus' resurrection. But human beings still die. The separation from God has received an answer. But creation still knows pain. The story is resolved. And at the same time, it's still waiting for an ending. That's why the last book of the Bible matters so much for the path we've been tracing. Revelation doesn't just show up to tack strange images onto the end of Scripture. It does something far more interesting. It starts gathering up images we left behind, one after another, as if the Bible were retracing its own steps. A lamb appears again, but now it isn't at a doorway in Egypt, or on an altar in the temple. It appears at the center of a heavenly vision, and it carries the marks of having been sacrificed. Once again, death and victory appear together. A kingdom returns too. A throne returns. The nations return. And finally, a figure returns that we haven't seen named this way since the beginning. The ancient serpent. Revelation identifies it with the great adversary. Suddenly, that image from Genesis 3 stops looking like a stray detail from the Bible's opening pages. The serpent still belongs to the conflict. The promise is still moving toward its resolution. But there's something even more surprising. As Revelation nears its final pages, it doesn't just bring back the enemy from Genesis. It brings back the world we had lost. The Bible had begun with a creation. Now it speaks of a new creation. It had begun with God dwelling with humanity. Now it describes that closeness again. It had begun with a river and a tree of life. And those images return too. After thousands of pages, we're drawing near the garden once more. But not exactly the same garden. Because the story has been through too much to simply return to its starting point. There has been a fall, a promise, sacrifices, an exodus, a kingdom, an exile, a cross, a resurrection. The ending doesn't erase that story. It completes it. And maybe now we can understand why the pattern needed to repeat so many times. Each repetition was teaching us a piece of the language we'd need to recognize the ending. Without Isaac, we might not understand substitution the same way. Without Passover, the lamb would just be an animal. Without the Exodus, deliverance would lose part of its meaning. Without the temple, we wouldn't feel the weight of a presence behind a barrier. Without David, we wouldn't be expecting an eternal king. Without the exile, the return wouldn't carry the same weight. All of those stories once looked separate. But now they start behaving like chapters of a single story. And there's still one more thing worth looking at carefully, the place where all of these images finally come to rest. Because when the Bible returns to the tree of life, there will be one decisive difference. This time, the way to it will no longer be closed. The tree of life appears once more in the last pages of the Bible. Throughout our whole journey, it had stayed out of reach. After the fall, Adam and Eve were cast out of the garden. The way was guarded, and humanity began a story marked by distance, pain, and death. Now that old barrier disappears. Revelation describes a river of the water of life flowing from the throne of God. On both sides stands the tree of life. Its leaves are tied to the healing of the nations. The nations. That word carries us far back. All the way to Babel. All the way to Abraham. All the way to that promise that through his offspring, the families of the earth would receive blessing. What began with one man leaving his home ends with peoples and nations gathered together in a restored creation. But there's an even more important phrase. There will be no more curse. Remember when that first appeared. After Adam and Eve took the fruit, the earth became bound to pain, labor, and finally death. Since then, almost the entire Bible has unfolded inside a world living under the consequences of that break. Noah was linked to the hope of rest from that ground. Abraham received a promise of blessing. Israel received a land. The prophets pictured restoration. But now, for the first time, the Bible speaks of the curse as something that will no longer be there. What began in Genesis finally meets its opposite. And one image is still missing: the presence of God. In the garden, humanity could live close to it. Then came the expulsion. Later, the tabernacle appeared. God dwelled in the middle of Israel, but behind boundaries. Then came the temple. Bigger, more permanent, but still with a curtain. Still with priests. Still with sacrifices. Now Revelation describes a city and makes a striking observation. There is no temple in it. After everything the temple meant throughout the biblical story, its absence might seem like a loss. But exactly the opposite is true. There's no need for a building to hold God's presence in one place, because that presence fills the reality being described. The story doesn't end by rebuilding the barrier. It ends by removing the need for one. And then one of the simplest, most profound phrases in the whole pattern appears. Human beings will see the face of God. Think about the distance it took to get there. Adam hid. Moses was given limits around the mountain. The high priest entered the most sacred space only once a year. Whole generations learned that drawing near to the divine presence was never something trivial. And now the end of the Bible describes a humanity that no longer hides. There's no expulsion. There's no curtain. There's no closed door to the tree. What was lost at the beginning has come back. So we can return to our original question. Has the Bible really been telling the same story over and over again? After following it from Genesis to Revelation, maybe we can put the pattern into clearer words. Something good is given. The human being loses it. A promise appears. That promise seems to draw closer to fulfillment. A figure emerges who might be the answer. But something is left unfinished. Then the story starts again, carrying one more piece with it. Adam receives a world and loses it. Noah receives a fresh start, but not a new heart. Abraham receives a promise, but dies still waiting for most of it. Isaac is spared, but sacrifice is still needed. Israel is freed from Egypt, but not from its own tendency to rebel. Moses frees the people, but can't carry the story all the way to its destination. The judges rescue Israel, but only for a while. David receives a kingdom, but dies. Solomon builds the temple, but drifts away. Israel enters the land and later ends up in exile. Again and again the story seems to draw close. And again we find that something is still missing. That's what makes the repetitions matter. They aren't just copies. Each one reveals what kind of solution isn't enough. A new place isn't enough. A fresh start isn't enough. A law isn't enough. A human deliverer isn't enough. An ordinary king isn't enough. A sacrifice that has to be repeated isn't enough either. The story needs something able to gather up all of these images and carry them further than any one of them had reached on its own. That's why, when the New Testament presents Jesus using the language of son, lamb, king, servant, temple, and son of man all at once, those images carry centuries of history behind them. They don't come out of nowhere. They've been prepared, repeated, expanded. And when Revelation finally brings the reader back to the tree, the river, the nations, and the presence of God, we can understand something that would have been impossible to see in the opening pages. The Bible doesn't simply end where it began. It ends by answering what began. The serpent that appeared in Genesis meets its defeat. The curse disappears. Death no longer has the final word. The nations receive the blessing. And the way to life stands open again. The circle seems to close. But our investigation isn't finished yet. Because so far we've followed the pattern from a great distance, watching how the stories connect. Now we need to go back. Look at those connections much more closely. Because some of the most surprising ones are hidden in details that seem small. Names, places, objects, rituals, phrases separated by centuries. And when we start placing them side by side, we discover that the pattern runs even deeper than it seemed. One of these details shows up so early in the Bible that it's easy to read right past it. Blood. We first saw it after Abel's death. Cain had taken his brother out to the field and killed him. When God confronted him, he didn't simply speak of a buried body or a life lost. He said Abel's blood was crying out from the ground. From its very first appearance, then, blood is tied to a life taken and to something demanding a response. But by the time we reach Abraham, the image starts to shift. Isaac is on the altar. The knife is ready. And before his blood is spilled, a ram appears. Another takes his place. Later in Egypt, blood appears again. This time it doesn't cry out from the ground. It's on a doorway. Inside the house is a family. Outside is death. And the blood serves as a sign that a sacrifice has already taken place there. Then we reach the tabernacle. Now blood shows up again and again. On the altar. In the sacrifices. In the purification rituals. On the Day of Atonement. What began as the mark of a life taken becomes, at the same time, an image tied to the possibility of drawing near to God once more. And here we need to pause. Because if we only look at the sacrifices, we can miss a much older question. Why was drawing near ever necessary in the first place? The answer takes us back to the garden. The fall's first consequence wasn't simply that human beings would someday die. Before dying they hid. The break created distance. Then came the expulsion. That's why, when the Bible introduces sacrifices, priests, and sanctuaries, it isn't creating a brand new theme. It's working on a wound we already know. How can what was cast out draw near again? Israel receives a partial answer. There can be a sanctuary. There can be priests. There can be sacrifices. But the whole system seems to say two things at once. God wants to be near. And something still keeps that nearness from being complete. Maybe no image captures that tension better than the curtain. On one side is the people. On the other, the space specially tied to the divine presence. Between them is a barrier. But even that curtain holds a strange detail. Cherubim. The same creatures that appeared after the expulsion from Eden show up there again. In Genesis, they guarded the way to the tree of life. Now they appear around the space the people still can't freely enter. The Bible doesn't need to say, "Remember the garden." The image does that on its own. And that lets us see the tabernacle differently. It isn't just a religious tent in the middle of the desert. It's also a kind of reminder of how close, and at the same time how far humanity still is from what it lost. Then we reach Solomon's temple. And the pattern becomes even more visible. Its decoration includes flowers, palm trees, and cherubim. Images of life surround the place where God dwells with his people. As if the architecture itself were holding on to a memory. A lost garden. A lost presence. A way that still needs to be restored. But there's something neither the tabernacle nor the temple can get rid of. Repetition. The sacrifices keep going. The priests keep going. The Day of Atonement comes back every year. Each repetition seems to say that the solution is real, but still not final. Then the prophets begin imagining something greater. Ezekiel receives a vision of a future temple. Water flows out from that temple. At first it's just a trickle. Then it grows. It becomes a river. And wherever it reaches, life appears. Trees grow along its banks. Their fruit serves as food. Their leaves are tied to healing. Pause on those images for a moment. A place of divine presence. A river, trees, life, healing. We're no longer just inside the language of a building. We're drawing near once again to the language of Eden. And centuries later, when we reach the final pages of Revelation, the river returns. It flows from the throne of God. The tree of life returns. Its leaves are tied to the healing of the nations. What Ezekiel had seen as a vision of the future ends up connected to what Genesis had placed at the very beginning. Garden, temple, river, tree, presence. These aren't images that appear just once. They transform as they move through the Bible. And then something even more interesting happens in the New Testament. Jesus enters the temple. But when he speaks about destroying it and raising it up again, the narrative explains that he's talking about his own body. The temple stops being just a place. The image starts concentrating into a person. This follows exactly the movement we've already been tracing. Israel had been a nation. Then certain images of Israel began concentrating into Jesus. The sacrifice had been an animal. Then the language of sacrifice began concentrating into Jesus. Now the same thing happens with the temple. The question of where God's presence can be found starts receiving an unexpected answer. Not only behind a curtain. Not only inside a building. In a person. And if that's true, then Jesus' death takes on another dimension. When the temple curtain tears, we aren't just watching a dramatic detail surrounding the crucifixion. We're watching an image that began in Genesis finally start to change. The closed path, the cherubim, the barrier, the repeated sacrifices. All of it had been teaching the meaning of separation. And now the barrier opens. But we still have to ask something. If the temple, the sacrifice, and the presence are starting to come together in one person, what happens to the priest? Because someone still has to cross that distance. Someone has to represent humanity before God. And when we follow that image further, we find that even the priesthood was waiting for something it could never complete on its own. The priest holds a strange place in the biblical story. He's part of the people, yet he enters spaces the rest of the people can't enter. He carries the same human limitations as those he represents, and yet he has to stand before God on their behalf. That's why he can't simply come as he is either. Before offering for others, he has to offer for himself. Before representing the people, he has to admit he shares the same problem. That small limitation tells us a lot. Israel has priests, but it still doesn't have the definitive priest. Every generation needs new men because the old ones grow old and die. Every year needs new sacrifices because the old ones never close the distance for good. The system keeps running precisely because it stays incomplete. And then a strange figure appears in a much older story. Long before Israel's priesthood even exists, Abraham returns from a battle and meets a man named Melchizedek. The scene is brief. Brief enough to be easy to overlook. Melchizedek is king of Salem. But he's also priest of God Most High. King and priest. Two roles that will later be clearly separate within Israel show up joined in a single figure. Melchizedek blesses Abraham. Abraham gives him 1/10 of everything he gained. And then the man disappears almost as quickly as he appeared. For generations it looks like an isolated detail. Until the Psalms mention him again. In a psalm about a king, an unexpected statement appears. That ruler will be a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. There's that word again. Forever. We'd heard it around David's throne. Now it appears around a priest. An eternal king. A permanent priest. Two lines that seem to be running separately start moving closer together. And when the New Testament reflects on Jesus, it reaches back for that very same ancient figure. The reason starts to become clear. Ordinary priests die. Their role passes on to others. Jesus, after passing through death and rising again, doesn't need to hand his role to a successor. The resurrection also changes what priesthood means. For the first time, the Bible can picture a mediator whose role doesn't end because his life ends. And that transforms the sacrifice too. Israel's priests offered something other than themselves. Animals, blood, offerings. But in Jesus, priest and sacrifice start to become one. He doesn't just present the offering. He himself becomes the thing being offered. Think about how many lines come together here. Abraham's ram took Isaac's place. The Passover lamb died while the firstborn stayed alive. The tabernacle's sacrifices let the people draw near. The high priest carried blood behind the curtain. Isaiah spoke of a servant wounded for others. And now a figure appears who brings together mediator and sacrifice. This isn't just another repetition. It's a concentration. Several old images are converging on the same point. But there's one more piece we need to recover. The scapegoat. On the Day of Atonement, there wasn't just an image of blood carried into the sanctuary. Another animal appeared too. The people's guilt was symbolically placed on it. Then it was sent away. Outside the camp. Into the desert. An image of what defile being carried away from the community. For centuries, Israel watched that movement. Guilt. Transfer. Expulsion. And here we find another reversal of Eden. In Genesis, the guilty human beings were cast out. In the ritual, what represents their guilt is sent away so the people can stay. The question running through both scenes is the same. What has to leave so that humanity can remain? When we reach the story of Jesus, even the place of his death starts to matter. He's taken outside, rejected, cast out. The figure who represents the presence of God ends up treated as someone who doesn't belong inside. As if he were carrying the place that, since Genesis, had belonged to humanity. And if we follow that reversal all the way through, the logic of the pattern becomes striking. The human being had been cast out of the presence. Now someone goes out to open the way back. The human being had carried the curse. Now the king wears thorns on his head. The sacrifice had died in another's place. Now the priest becomes the sacrifice too. The images are no longer simply repeating. They're trading places. What once fell on many begins concentrating into one. And what once seemed reserved for one begins opening up to many. That's why the torn curtain matters so much. It doesn't just signal that a ritual has changed. It signals that the entire direction of the story is changing. For centuries the question had been, who can enter? Now another one starts to appear. What would happen if God's presence were no longer limited to a place only a few could approach? That question leads us back to Pentecost. The Spirit doesn't come down on a building. It comes down on people. And little by little, the New Testament starts using, for human communities, a word that once belonged only to the sanctuary. Temple. The pattern expands again. First a garden. Then a tent. Then a building. Then a person. And now a people. But Revelation will carry that transformation one step further still. Because in the end, when God's presence fills the new creation, there's no separate sanctuary left to travel to. The story of the temple ends when all of creation becomes, in a sense, the meeting place the garden had pointed to from the very beginning. And that brings us back to the true center of the pattern. It was never just about sacrifices, or priests, or even temples. Since Genesis, the story had been searching for a way to answer a much more intimate question. How can humanity live with God again? That question runs through the Bible with far more force than it seems. Because from the moment Adam hides, almost everything that follows can be read as a story about distance and return. Abraham leaves one land to walk toward another that God will show him. Israel leaves Egypt to head toward a promised land. The tabernacle places God's presence in the middle of the camp. The temple gives it a permanent home in Jerusalem. The exile separates the people from their land and their sanctuary once again. And the prophets begin imagining a return far greater than simply going back to a city. Ezekiel, for instance, sees an extraordinary vision. He watches the glory of God moving away from the temple before Jerusalem falls. It's a scene of departure. The presence withdraws. Then the city falls. The temple is destroyed. And the people end up far from home. But Ezekiel also sees something else. In his later visions, the presence returns. What had left comes back. The story of the exile, then, isn't only a political story about losing territory. It's also a story about presence, about distance, about the hope of returning. And when the New Testament introduces Jesus, it uses a simple phrase that carries enormous weight after everything we've traced so far. God with us, not just God on a mountain, not just God behind a curtain. With us, the direction of the movement reverses again. Since Eden, humanity had lived trying to recover what it lost. Now the presence comes toward it. Jesus walks among people who, by the religious categories of his time, often belonged to the margins. The sick, those considered unclean, sinners, people others prefer to keep at a distance. And again something peculiar happens. Uncleanness doesn't seem to take him over. The opposite happens. When he touches those others wouldn't touch, restoration is what spreads. A leper comes near. Under normal circumstances, touching him would mean coming into contact with his impurity. Jesus touches him, and the man is made clean. The usual direction has reversed. What's contaminated doesn't contaminate Jesus. Life seems to flow outward from him into what was broken. Then a woman who has been sick for years touches his clothing in a crowd. She too carries a story marked by impurity and separation. But again, the contact doesn't bring contamination onto Jesus. It brings healing to her. And then an even stronger scene appears. A young girl has died. Jesus takes her hand. Since Genesis, death has been the great force that eventually reaches everything. Touching a corpse meant coming close to what represented life's ultimate limit. But when Jesus touches the girl, it isn't death that gets passed on. The girl gets up. Once again the direction shifts. Life toward death. Purity toward impurity. Presence toward those who were far off. The pattern starts showing us something the old rituals could only partly represent. Maybe the final restoration won't come by keeping everything unclean permanently away from God. Maybe it will come when God's presence is able to enter what is broken and transform it. That helps explain why so many scenes in the Gospels happen around tables. Jesus eats with people others consider unworthy. A meal, something so ordinary, becomes a small picture of belonging. Who gets to sit down? Who's left out? Who's welcomed in? And behind those tables, the shadow of a garden appears again, where humanity once ate in a place of communion with God. But there's one meal that gathers up all the others. The Last Supper. Jesus knows his death is near. He sits with his disciples. He takes bread. He takes a cup. And he turns the Passover meal into a promise pointing towards something still to come. Even on the eve of his death, he speaks of sharing a table again in the kingdom. The story keeps looking forward to a future meal. And when we reach Revelation, we find exactly that, a celebration described as a great banquet. Once again, restoration isn't just an abstract idea. It appears as people gathered together, as belonging, as a table, as a relationship no longer broken. Then the ending of Revelation carries that closeness even further. There isn't just a city. There isn't just a river and a tree. There's a declaration. The dwelling place of God is with human beings. The word that had moved through tabernacles and temples ends up describing a reality where God dwells with them. And suddenly we can look back and see a line that had stayed hidden behind so many others. Tabernacle, temple, Jesus, a people inhabited by the Spirit. New creation. Each stage seems to answer the same loss, but each one widens the answer. In the garden, the presence belongs to a place. In the tabernacle, it travels with a people. In the temple, it sits at the center of a nation. In Jesus, it walks among human beings. Then, through the Spirit, it begins to dwell within them. And in the end, it fills a restored creation. The direction is no longer toward an ever smaller sanctuary. It's toward an ever wider presence, until there's no longer any space left outside it. And then we understand why the end of the Bible doesn't need to simply rebuild Eden exactly as it was. The story has grown beyond the garden. It began with two human beings. It ends with nations. It began with a bounded place. It ends with a renewed creation. It began with a closed path to life. It ends with the tree of life accessible once again. But there's still one more image we need to follow. Because if the story is about returning to the presence of God, someone has been trying to block that return from the very beginning. The serpent disappeared for long stretches of our story, but it never disappeared from the pattern. And when it comes back into full view, we'll find that its own story has been repeating too. The serpent appears in Genesis, speaks for a handful of verses, and then seems to vanish. But the conflict it starts continues long after it stops being visible. Its first strategy wasn't force. It was distortion. It takes something true and twists it just enough to create doubt. Did God really say that? The question looks small, but behind it sits a much deeper suggestion. Maybe God isn't as good as he seems. Maybe he's holding something back. Maybe life would be better if the human being decided for himself what to take and what to reject. The serpent doesn't need to build a whole alternative. He just needs to break trust. And once that happens, Eve looks at the tree differently. Then Adam eats too. The break begins. But remember the promise that comes right after. There will be enmity. The woman's offspring and the serpent will stand against each other. Someone will be wounded, and the serpent's head will be crushed. From that moment on, the Bible carries an open conflict. But there's something strange about it. The serpent doesn't need to physically show up every time that conflict returns. Cain doesn't find a serpent in the field before killing Abel. And yet he repeats the same movement. He gets a warning. He faces a choice. And he decides to cross the line. Later, Babel doesn't need a serpent either. Humanity tries once again to raise itself up. It wants to make a name for itself. It wants to reach on its own what it considers greatness. The shape changes. The rebellion stays the same. Then we reach Egypt. And there the conflict takes on a political dimension. Pharaoh isn't a serpent, but he tries to destroy the sons of Israel, the very offspring through which the promise continues. He orders children killed. He tries to stop the people from growing. And when Israel finally escapes, Pharaoh chases after them. The old enmity between a promise and whatever tries to destroy it now plays out on a national scale. Then something curious happens in the desert. Snakes literally return. Israel has rebelled again, and the bites bring death into the camp. But this time the image of the serpent is lifted up. The thing that represents death is put on display in front of the people. And whoever looks lives. That scene stays strange for centuries, until Jesus picks it back up and ties it to his own death. Then the conflict concentrates once more into a single person. But before reaching the cross, the Gospels place Jesus in front of a temptation. And the setting matters. It doesn't happen in a garden full of food. It happens in the desert. Adam and Eve were surrounded by abundance and still took what had been forbidden. Jesus hasn't eaten in days. He's hungry. And there the tempter appears. Once again come words designed to plant doubt. If you really are who you say you are, do this. Prove that. Take a different path. The structure feels familiar. A voice. An identity put to the test. A chance to take something before the right time. But this time the answer changes. Jesus doesn't take. He doesn't turn the temptation into obedience to his own desire. He doesn't try to produce on his own what has already been promised to him. Where the first story ended with a hand reaching toward the fruit, this one ends with the temptation refused. The pattern has returned. But this time someone walks through it without repeating the failure. That explains why the conflict starts to intensify. As Jesus moves forward, the language surrounding his mission makes clear he isn't just confronting human problems. Illness, oppression, death, deception. All of it seems to be part of one broken reality that has to be confronted. And then Jesus starts speaking of his death as though it were also a victory. That combination should feel familiar by now. Since Genesis, we'd been waiting for someone who would be wounded while defeating the serpent. And victory. Not one after the other as separate events. Both within the same confrontation. That's why the cross can look like a defeat if you only view it from the outside. Jesus is arrested. His enemies manage to condemn him. His disciples flee. The promised king ends up nailed to wood. But if you remember Genesis, the question shifts. What if the wound was always part of the victory? The old promise never said the offspring would come through unscathed. It said there would be a strike against him, and another against the serpent. Suddenly, what seemed to prove that Jesus had lost starts to look exactly like the strange kind of victory the first prophecy had left open. Then the resurrection comes. And death, the weapon that had followed humanity since the garden, fails to hold him. The strike happened. The wound was real. But it wasn't final. Even so, even after the resurrection, the Bible still doesn't declare the whole conflict over. The world keeps waiting. And that's why Revelation finally brings back the image we started with. The serpent returns. But it no longer appears simply as an animal in a garden. Now it's described as a great D. And Revelation doesn't leave that defeat as a distant possibility. Carries it all the way through. The ancient serpent, The presence that first planted doubt in the garden finally loses what it had managed to hold onto through the whole story: its power to accuse, to deceive, to destroy. The conflict that began around a tree finally reaches its resolution after running through the entire Bible. But here's something important happens. The serpent's defeat isn't the true ending, because destroying the enemy alone isn't enough to restore what was lost. Death is still there. Pain is still there. The distance that began when human beings hid from God is still there. And Revelation starts closing each of those wounds, one by one. First comes the final defeat of the one that had risen up against God. Then death itself comes to an end. Think about how long we've been waiting for that moment. Death entered our story as a warning. Then it became experience. Abel died. The genealogies began repeating one unavoidable phrase. And he died. And he died. And he died. Noah survived the flood, but he died. Abraham received the promise, but he died. Moses saw the land from a distance, but he died. David received the promise of an eternal throne, but he died. Throughout the whole Bible, even the most important people kept reaching that same limit. Until the resurrection. There, for the first time, something different appeared. Not a person temporarily escaping death. A person passing through it and coming back. And now, in these final pages, what began with one person spreads out to all of creation. Death no longer has a permanent place. The last enemy disappears. And then the Bible does something extraordinary. Instead of simply ending with a victory, it starts rebuilding the images from the beginning. A new creation appears. A city appears. A river appears. And once again appears the thing we hadn't been able to reach since Genesis. The tree of life. After thousands of pages, it's there again. But remember the last time we saw it? Adam and Eve had been cast out. Cherubim guarded the way. Humanity couldn't reach out and take from that tree. Now there's no sword blocking the way. No prohibition. The tree is available. And its leaves are tied to the healing of the nations. The nations. The ones that began scattering at Babel. The ones the promise to Abraham had pointed toward. The ones that appeared in the prophet's visions. Now they're present in this final scene. Suddenly, a promise spoken thousands of years earlier finds its place inside the Bible's very last image. But there's something even deeper. Revelation says there will be no more curse. That phrase might seem small after so many enormous visions. It isn't. The curse belongs to Genesis, to the wounded ground, to painful labor, to thorns, to death. Our entire story has unfolded inside its consequences. And now, near the very end, the Bible simply declares that it will no longer be there. The crown of thorns we saw on Jesus' head then carries an even deeper weight. The king had worn an image of the curse on himself. And at the end of the story, the curse disappears. Then the presence appears. There's no temple. That would have been unthinkable through most of the Old Testament. The temple had been the center. The place of sacrifice. The place of priesthood. The place tied to the presence of God. But in the new creation it isn't needed. Not because the presence has left, but because it's everywhere. There's no longer a room behind a curtain. There's no longer a space only a priest can enter. There's no longer a barrier reminding humanity that it's still on the outside. God dwells with human beings. And then comes, perhaps, the most intimate reversal of all. They will see his face. Go back for a moment to the garden. Adam hears God and hides. That was one of humanity's first movements after the fall. Hiding. Now at the end no one hides. The story that began with human beings fleeing the presence ends with human beings gazing at the very face they once feared to meet. And maybe now we can see the whole pattern. Not as a collection of coincidences, but as a single movement. The garden is lost. Then the tabernacle appears. Then the temple. Then the presence of God draws near in a person. Then it dwells in a people. And finally it fills a restored creation. The sacrifice begins with animals. Then the Passover lamb appears. Then the sacrifices repeat generation after generation, until the image concentrates into a single sacrifice that never needs to be repeated. The promise begins with a descendant. It passes through Abraham, through Israel, through David, until it concentrates into a king whose victory comes precisely through the wound that seemed to defeat him. And the serpent begins whispering beside a tree. It ends defeated when the tree of life is once again within humanity's reach. The beginning and the end are looking at each other. But one last question remains. Because if all of these connections really do form a single story, then maybe Genesis wasn't just starting the Bible. Maybe, quietly, it was already teaching us how it would end. And maybe that's why some of the earliest pages of the Bible feel so different once you've made it all the way to the last ones. The garden no longer looks like just an ancient setting. The tree no longer looks like just a tree. The serpent no longer looks like a character who disappears after a few verses. The expulsion no longer looks like simply the end of a story about disobedience. All of it was opening questions that would need the rest of the Bible to find their answer. How will humanity return? What will happen to death? Who will defeat the serpent? How will blessing reach the nations? Who will sit on the throne that never ends? And how can God dwell with human beings again without a barrier between them? For centuries, no answer seems to be enough. Noah receives a new world, but the human heart stays the same. Abraham receives a promise, but he dies before seeing it fully fulfilled. Moses frees Israel, but he can't free them from what they carry inside. The law shows the way, but it doesn't on its own transform those who have to walk it. The sacrifices offer forgiveness, but they have to be repeated. The priests bring the people near, but they themselves grow old and die. David receives a kingdom, but no king from his line manages to hold on to it forever. The temple brings God's presence close, but there's still a curtain. The prophets promise restoration, but they die still waiting for what they announce. One answer after another gets partway there, and stops, until all of those stories start coming together. The promised son, the sacrifice, the lamb, the deliverer, the bread in the desert, the prophet, the priest, the temple, the wounded servant, the king. For centuries they looked like separate images, but when they reach the New Testament they start converging around a single life. And then we understand why the story had to repeat so many times. Not because the Bible was telling exactly the same event over and over, but because it was teaching us how to recognize it. Each repetition added a word to the language. Abraham taught something about promise. Isaac, something about substitution. Passover, something about deliverance. The desert, something about dependence. The tabernacle, something about presence. The sacrifices, something about atonement. David, something about kingship. The exile, something about loss and return. The prophets, something about what was still missing. And when those images finally meet, we discover that none of them was complete on its own. Maybe that's why the Bible can sometimes feel like a huge collection of different stories. There are gardens and deserts, shepherds and kings, slaves and priests, wars, temples, exiles, prophets, letters, visions, characters separated by hundreds of years who could never have known each other. But underneath all that variety runs a strikingly steady movement. Presence, loss, promise, rescue, failure, another promise, and finally restoration. The story moves forward, but it also remembers. Each new stage carries echoes of the one before it. The flood waters resurface in the Exodus in a different form. The sacrifice of Isaac finds an echo in Passover. Passover finds another in the cross. The garden casts its shadow over the tabernacle over the temple. And the temple ends up pointing toward a presence that no longer needs to be enclosed inside a building. Babel scatters people. Abraham receives the promise of blessing for the families of the earth. Pentecost gathers people of many languages around a single message. The tree of life is lost, and the tree of life returns. The serpent appears, and the serpent is defeated. The curse begins, and the curse ends. Humanity hides from the face of God, and the story ends by saying they will see it. Maybe that's the simplest connection of all. The Bible begins with God and humanity together. Something breaks that union, and everything that follows is the long road back to the moment they're together again. Not exactly as before, because the ending is greater than the beginning. Genesis showed us a couple inside a garden. Revelation shows us peoples and nations inside a renewed creation. Genesis had a tree in the middle of the garden. Revelation keeps the tree, but now its leaves are tied to the healing of the nations. The story doesn't just move backward. It moves forward toward a wider restoration. And maybe that's why that first promise was so small. It didn't explain everything. It didn't need to. It only spoke of an offspring, of a wound, of a defeated serpent. Everything else would have to be discovered slowly, generation after generation, story after story, prophecy after prophecy, until we could finally reach the last pages, look back, and recognize that many things that once seemed separate were answering the same question. The question that began when two human beings hid among the trees. How does a story end after something perfect breaks? The Bible's answer takes thousands of years to unfold. It doesn't end by ignoring the break, or by simply going back to the moment before it. It ends by going through it. And on the other side, the river, the tree, and the presence appear once again. Only this time there's no serpent waiting by the path, no sword blocking the entrance, no curtain, no exile, and no death. And here, finally, we can return to the line we started with. The Bible might be telling the same story over and over again. Now we know that doesn't mean every story is identical. It means certain questions never disappear. They come back. They change shape. They grow deeper. And every time they return, we learn a little more of the answer. The promise given in the garden was barely a seed. It had no name, no date. It didn't explain how the victory would happen. It only said the story wouldn't end with the serpent. Then Abraham came. And we learned the answer would be tied to a descendant and to a blessing able to reach the nations. Moses came. And we learned the language of deliverance. Passover came. And we learned that one life could be spared while another was given up. The tabernacle came. And we learned how costly it was to draw near to God's presence again. David came. And we began waiting for a king. The prophets came. And we discovered that king would be tied to something far stranger. Suffering. Rejection. A wound. A new covenant. A new heart. Then Jesus came. And all those lines that had seemed to run separately began to meet. The descendant was also the king. The king was also the servant. The servant was also the sacrifice. The sacrifice was also the priest. And what looked like a defeat became the very place where the garden's ancient promise finally started finding its answer. But even the cross needed a morning after. Because the real enemy was never just Rome, or Egypt, or Babylon. All of those empires could vanish and be replaced by others. The wound was older than that. Death had been there since Genesis. That's why the empty tomb matters so much within the pattern. It isn't simply someone who had died coming back. It's the first sign that the thing which had ruled the story since the garden no longer necessarily has the final word. And that's why Revelation can end the way it does. Not with human beings escaping creation, but with creation being renewed. Not with humanity moving away from God, but with God dwelling with them. Not with a closed door, but with a tree within reach. Maybe the most surprising connection in the whole Bible isn't a prophecy hidden in a single verse. Maybe it's the shape of the whole story. It begins with life. Life breaks. A promise appears. The promise runs through generations. It seems to fail again and again, but it holds, until what was lost at the beginning comes back at the end, transformed and complete. And now you can picture the two scenes one last time. In the first, a man and a woman leave a garden. Behind them stands the tree of life. The way closes. Ahead of them lies a world that will now know pain, conflict, and death. They don't know how long that story will last. They don't know Abraham. They don't know Moses. They don't know David. They haven't heard Isaiah. They know nothing of a cross. All they know is that they're leaving. Now look at the last scene. The tree is there again. So is the river. So is humanity. But no one is being cast out. There's no serpent offering another lie. There's no brother rising up against another. There's no Pharaoh chasing slaves. There's no people walking into exile. There's no priest entering alone behind a curtain. There's no tomb waiting to receive the next name in a genealogy. The long repetition finally stops. Because what each story could only resolve for a moment has now found a final answer. And maybe that's why the ending of the Bible feels strangely familiar. We'd already seen its images. We'd just never seen them all together. The river, the tree, the nations, the kingdom, the presence, life. They were scattered throughout the story. Revelation simply gathers them. And when it does, we understand that the Bible had never forgotten its beginning. It had been walking toward it the whole time. So the next time you go back to Genesis and find that serpent beside the tree, maybe the scene won't look so small anymore. Because behind it, you can hear the echo of an immense story. A story that will pass through families, slaves, deserts, kings, temples, prophets, empires, and tombs. A story that will need the whole Bible to finish telling itself. And maybe that was the pattern that had been hiding in front of us the whole time. Not a collection of secret predictions waiting to be decoded, but a promise that began almost as a whisper, that kept repeating from generation to generation, that revealed a little more each time, until it reached the last book, the last vision, the tree that was once lost, and a humanity that, after the whole story, has finally come home.